There is a category of problem that almost everyone has and almost no one fixes. Not the big problems, those get attention because they demand it. Not the crises or the emergencies or the things that arrive loudly enough to make ignoring them impossible. Those get handled because they leave no choice. The category of problem that quietly does the most damage is smaller than that. Quieter. So minor in its individual appearance that the decision to leave it unaddressed feels not just reasonable but practically wise. A sign of priorities correctly ordered, attention correctly directed, energy correctly conserved for the things that actually matter. The loose brick. Everyone has one. Sometimes it is literal, a small thing in a home or an office that has been meaning to be fixed for so long that it has stopped being noticed as a problem and started being accepted as a feature of the landscape. Sometimes it is professional, a small friction in a process, a minor misunderstanding left unaddressed, a pattern in a relationship that is not yet a conflict but is clearly becoming one. Sometimes it is personal, a habit so small it barely registers, a conversation being avoided because the stakes feel too low to justify the discomfort of having it now. The loose brick is never urgent. That is precisely what makes it dangerous, because the things that are never urgent have a way of becoming inevitable. And the distance between a 5-minute fix and a weeks-long recovery is almost always paved with the accumulated decision to step over something rather than stop and deal with it. Stay with us, because today we are telling the story of Radner, a man who spent months stepping over a loose brick and discovered, on a rainy Tuesday with a twisted ankle and a shattered storm door, exactly what that decision had been costing him, and what he changed that made everything that followed lighter. And if stories like this one matter to you, subscribe, because somebody out there needs to hear exactly this today. Radner was 41 years old and extremely good at prioritizing. This was not a small thing. In his professional life, he ran operations for a mid-sized logistics company. The ability to triage, to identify what demanded immediate attention and what could wait, to resist the pull of the minor in service of the major, was genuinely valuable. He had built his reputation on it. His manager described him as someone who never got lost in the weeds. His team knew him as the person who could walk into a complicated situation, identify the two things that actually mattered, and ignore everything else with a discipline that bordered on ruthless. It was, in almost every professional context, an asset. It was, in the context of his actual life, beginning to cause problems he had not yet recognized as problems. The loose brick on his front step had been loose for approximately 4 months when Radner first noticed it properly. Not the vague, peripheral noticing that had been happening since it first shifted, the automatic, below-conscious registration that something was slightly wrong, but the proper, eyes-down noticing that comes when a thing announces itself clearly enough to demand a moment of real attention. He stepped on it on a Thursday morning and felt the familiar slight shift beneath his foot and thought, with complete clarity, genuine intention, and zero follow-through, I should fix that. He had a meeting in 40 minutes. He had a report due by noon. He had 3 conversations waiting in his inbox that each required a response before the day could move forward. He had, in the language of his professional framework, real problems to solve. The brick was a minor issue, a 5-minute fix on a weekend when he had the time and the tools and the margin for small domestic tasks. He stepped over it and got in his car. This is where the story of the loose brick actually begins, not with the brick itself, with the stepping over. Because the stepping over was not a single decision made once and forgotten. It was a decision made every morning on the way out and every evening on the way in, a repeated, reinforced, daily choice to root around a small problem rather than through it. And repeated choices, however minor their individual weight, accumulate. They form grooves. They shape not just behavior but perception. The way a person begins to see the landscape of their own life and what within it deserves attention. Radner began, without fully realizing it, to step over things, not just the brick. At work, a small error appeared in the weekly operational report, a figure that did not reconcile, minor enough that it had not affected any decision, unlikely to be noticed by anyone who was not looking carefully. Radnor noticed it. He also noticed that correcting it would require a conversation with the analyst who had produced the report, a conversation that would need to be navigated carefully because the analyst was new and the error, if raised clumsily, could land as criticism rather than correction. It was not a big problem. It was, in the vocabulary he had developed for his front step, a loose brick. He stepped over it. He would address it next week when the pattern became clearer. A member of his team, a project coordinator named Sheila who had been with the company for 3 years and whose work Radnor genuinely relied on, had been quieter than usual in the previous 2 weeks. Not dramatically so. Not in a way that had produced any visible decline in her output or any behavior that could be pointed to as a problem, just quieter, a slight withdrawal from the casual conversation that had always characterized her presence in the office, a muted quality in meetings where she had previously been engaged. Radnor noticed. He also assessed. It was not a conflict. It was not a crisis. It was not, by any reasonable measure, a situation that required urgent intervention. It was a minor signal from a team member who was perhaps having a difficult few weeks, the kind of thing that resolved itself more often than not without managerial involvement. He stepped over it. He would check in with her when things settled down a little. The pattern extended into his home life with the same quiet efficiency. A conversation with his wife about finances that had been started twice and not finished, stepped over, deferred to a weekend that kept not arriving. A tension with his teenage son that had not yet crystallized into anything definable, stepped over, set aside, assigned to the category of things that were probably fine and would likely resolve without intervention. Radnor was not neglecting his life. He was managing it. Triaging it with the same practice skill he applied to his professional responsibilities. Keeping his attention on the things that were genuinely large and genuinely urgent, and trusting that the things that were small and not yet urgent would either resolve themselves or grow large enough to demand attention when the time was right. He did not understand yet that some things do not grow large enough to demand attention. They simply accumulate. Quietly, without announcement, in the form of a life that requires more energy to navigate than it should, because the small frictions that could have been resolved in 5 minutes have been left in place long enough to become the permanent architecture of the landscape. The rainy Tuesday arrived on the kind of evening that had already been difficult before it became the evening of the loose brick. Radnor had left work later than intended. The drive home had been slow in the rain. He was carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries because he had gone to the store before coming home rather than after, which had seemed efficient when he decided it, and felt less efficient now with the bags cutting into his hands and his mind still partly in the office working through a problem that had not been solved before he left. He was not thinking about the brick. He had stepped over it so many times that the stepping over had become as automatic as the brick's original looseness, a feature of the landscape so thoroughly incorporated into his unconscious movement through that space that it no longer required any conscious allocation of attention, except that the rain had made the steps slick. And the bags were heavy and awkwardly balanced, and his attention was elsewhere, and the foot that should have cleared the brick landed on it instead. The shift beneath his foot was not the small, familiar wobble of a Thursday morning on the way to a meeting. It was the full displacement of a brick that had been sitting in a compromised position for 4 months, and had finally found a configuration of weight and angle and wet stone beneath it that it could not hold against. Radnor's foot slid. His ankle turned in a way ankles are not designed to turn. The groceries went first, both bags, the contents distributing themselves across the wet pavement in the particular chaos of things dropped from height. He followed them, catching himself partially on the storm door as he went down, his elbow hitting the glass panel with enough force to shatter it. He sat on the wet pavement for a moment. Not in dramatic pain, the ankle hurt, the elbow was bleeding slightly, the groceries were a loss, But none of it was the part that kept him sitting there longer than the physical situation required. What kept him sitting was the sudden, disorienting clarity of a person who has just seen something they should have seen months earlier. The brick had not caused an accident. The brick had caused the inevitability of an accident. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. An accident was something that could not have been predicted or prevented. What had happened on his front step was neither. It had been predictable from the first Thursday morning. He had felt the shift beneath his foot and told himself he would fix it on the weekend. It had been preventable at any of the hundreds of subsequent moments he had rooted around it rather than through it. It was not bad luck or unfortunate timing or the cruel indifference of a rainy Tuesday evening. It was the compounded interest of a 4-month decision to step over something rather than stop and spend 5 minutes fixing it. He sat in the rain and thought about the report with the unreconciled figure. He had not addressed it the following week as he had told himself he would. He had not addressed it the week after that either. 3 weeks ago, a client had run their own reconciliation against the same data set and found the discrepancy. And the conversation that followed had not been the gentle, carefully navigated correction Radner had been intending to have with his analyst. It had been a client expressing, with justifiable directness, that an error of this kind raised questions about the reliability of the data they were receiving. The client had not left. But the relationship had cooled in a way that was going to require significant effort to restore. A 5-minute conversation with his analyst, had he had it when he first noticed the error, would have cost him 5 minutes. He thought about Sheila. She had resigned 2 weeks ago. Not dramatically, professionally, graciously, with 2 weeks' notice and a thank you for the opportunities she had been given. But she had resigned, and in the exit conversation she had been honest enough to say that she had been feeling undervalued for a while and had not felt that there was space to raise it. Radner had sat in that conversation with the particular discomfort of a person hearing something that they already knew and had chosen not to hear when there was still time to respond to it. He had noticed her withdrawal. He had stepped over it. A 5-minute check-in conversation, had he had it when he first noticed the signal, would have cost him 5 minutes. He looked at the shattered glass in the storm door and the groceries distributed across the pavement and felt the specific weight of a lesson arriving too late to prevent the cost it was explaining. The recovery from the ankle took 3 weeks of reduced mobility. He used them deliberately. He made a rule, not a complex system or an elaborate framework. A single, simple, non-negotiable rule: don't step over the brick. The next time he encountered a small friction, a process that was working but not well, a conversation that needed to happen before it needed to happen urgently, a minor misunderstanding that had not yet become a conflict, he stopped. He spent the 5 minutes. He fixed it before it had the chance to become something that could no longer be fixed in 5 minutes. The practice was not dramatic. That was the point. It was precisely as undramatic as the loose brick had been undramatic, small, quiet, entirely unremarkable in the moment of execution. But the accumulation of it changed the texture of his daily life in a way that compounded faster than he had expected. The energy he had been spending on routing around small, unresolved frictions, the unconscious vigilance, the altered gait, the low-level dread of things that had been left too long, was gradually released. Not all at once. Brick by brick, in the most literal sense. Each small thing addressed and resolved freed up a small amount of the cognitive and emotional bandwidth that had been quietly allocated to managing around it. By the time he was fully back on his feet, he felt lighter than he had in months, not because anything large had changed, because the small things had stopped accumulating. Success is not surviving the storm. This is the version of success that most people are building toward, the hardened, resilient, battle-tested capacity to withstand the large catastrophes that life occasionally delivers. And that capacity matters. Resilience is real and worth building. But the storms that break most people are not the large, visible ones that arrive with warning and demand immediate response. They are the accumulated pressure of 100 small frictions left unaddressed, The loose bricks that have been stepped over for so long that they have become the architecture of a life that requires more energy to navigate than it should. The report error left for later. The teammate's quiet withdrawal left unacknowledged. The conversation deferred until it is no longer a conversation but a crisis. The ship that weathers every storm is not the one with the strongest hull. It is the one whose crew fixes every small thing the moment it becomes visible, not because they have unlimited time or because nothing else demands attention, but because they understand that the 5 minutes spent on a small problem now is always cheaper than the weeks spent recovering from the large problem that small problem eventually becomes. Radner spent 4 months stepping over a loose brick. The storm door cost more to replace than every repair he had been putting off for a year. Look at your life right now, not at the big things, not at the crises and the urgent priorities and the real problems that deserve your real attention. Look at the small things, the things you have been stepping over, the frictions you have been routing around, the 5-minute fixes you have been deferring to a weekend that keeps not arriving. That is your loose brick, and the best time to fix it was 4 months ago. The second best time is now.